series we've got online on WePresent, which is an editorial platform in case you haven't seen it. And it's called Stuff They Don't Tell You, and basically the series is there because it's a series of articles about stuff that they kind of forgot to put in the curriculum or forgot to teach you at uni, really useful stuff that you don't necessarily, or the stuff that you really need to know about later in life. And so this is the first of a few events we're going to do where we're just kind of trying to put on events that are less about sort of like what's your inspiration and kind of that sort of thing. Because we've all been to a lot of those events. It's more sort of like we're trying to do something really useful. And so with that in mind, we're going to do this panel, and then we're just going to have quite a lot of question time. So I think the reason we did sort of how to fund your magazine is because, I mean, Jeremy and I have been to a lot of magazine conferences over the years, and that's kind of the question that everyone asks because obviously it's a very interesting question with lots of very distinct answers, and obviously the kind of like the whole magazine scene constantly changes as well, so there's so much to kind of keep up with. And but as you can tell, and what I love about coming to magCulture is just like when you see all these magazines that everyone's made, you know that a lot of them have done it on a shoestring. And you know, Jeremy said to me before, like there's not many magazines that do end up making it past issue 1 or 2, but some do, and they go on to issue 12, 13, 14, or they go on for 20 years. And I assume they're the ones that have worked out how to fund a magazine, but not necessarily. But I imagine some of you are working on magazines or thinking about working on magazines, and I'm hoping that this panel will answer some questions about how to get money to do so, because money is very important for magazines. Okay, so I think it's time, I suppose, just to meet the panelists, and then we'll just kind of go into talking about stuff, and then we'll do questions after about half an hour, 40 minutes. If it gets too hot, we can take breaks or whatever. But first I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then you can go through one by one and say what magazine you make. Jeremy, obviously, you can just talk generally about your life.
Half an hour, you say?
Yeah. So David Mckendrick is a British art director and graphic designer, and after making magazines for other people for years, he decided to start making his own, and he made it in lockdown, and it's called Paperboy, and it's wonderful. This is David. Oh, okay. That's Paperboy. And then obviously we have Jeremy Leslie, our favourite magazine shop owner, a man who has selflessly dedicated his life and career to magazines, which is not, as we know, the most stable economy.
Indeed.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. And also Zena Alkayat. Zena was a journalist for places like Metro and Time Out, and then she began publishing books. And then she moved into a flat with a small garden and started a magazine to find out more about gardening. So yeah, I would love, maybe starting with David, if you could just say a bit about your magazine. Not necessarily how you funded it, maybe just set up what it is, so everyone's got context as to why you're here.
Super duper. I'm happy to do that. And if you don't understand what I'm saying because I'm a bit too Scottish, then put a hand up and say, homie, what are you saying? And I'm very happy to be interrupted. So Paperboy is a magazine that was first launched a year and a half ago. I'm on issue 3 published, and I'm working on issue 4. It's a magazine with a few special things about it. First and foremost, it's only about good news. It's only about good news because it was born at a time where there was loads of shit news. There was Brexit, there was a pandemic. I'm an avid listener to Radio 4, and it sent me over the edge. I ended up on Magic FM. Every paper I picked up was disastrous, so I thought if there's one thing I could maybe bring with a magazine was a little bit of joy. I also teach or talk at universities, and there's a young chap come down today from far away, which is very flattering. And I've got some young people in my life who are at school age, and I really seen these guys struggle. They were graduating without a degree show, they were not seeing their mates at school, their mental health was going into decline, and I'm a graphic designer and art director, as Liv mentioned, and I think the last thing the world needed during the pandemic was another graphic designer doing a fucking poster about something random. So I thought I'm going to try and do something worthy. So I put together all the people that I've known from the magazine industry, all the photographers, writers and artists, with the people who were at school and with the undergraduates, and welded them together in a publication called Paperboy, which is only about good news, with the idea that it installed a bit of joy into people's life, and it gave opportunity to young people, and those young people were seen alongside the accomplished successful, established people, and therefore balanced something at some level.
Lovely.
So I think that's Paperboy.
Yeah.
I'll think other things along the way.
Yeah, we've got
that's a general.
That's great. And Jeremy, the reason, I mean, obviously it's a bit weird you being on the panel because you've done the shop, and it wasn't Jeremy didn't ask for the panel, it was me that asked for you to be on the panel. You always insist that you're part of every panel. But I know that you have spent so long, obviously in this shop, with everyone else's magazines, but also you had, your career was in magazines too.
Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you about stuff is obviously because of that kind of expertise and seeing the landscape change for so long. But how would you, could you just tell everyone a little bit about your, in a nutshell, your
Yes.
sort of career in magazines up until now?
Absolutely. So my background is design and art direction as well. That's what I was doing for maybe half my career. And then around about, if I said turn of the century, that sounds aeons ago, but it is 20 years ago now, isn't it? Yes. At the beginning of the 2000s, I sort of developed a parallel career, which was commentating and sort of observing what was happening in magazines. And the reason I got involved in that was because I was getting so annoyed at this kind of constant nagging noise that print was dead. And people going on and on about it. And they've been going on in the end through the 90s into the 2000s. 20 years later, they're still going on about it. And here we are, not just with two great panelists with two great magazines, but in a room full of great magazines. And print is anything but dead. So that's why a sort of magCulture sort of formed in my head as a small thing, and it's just sort of taken me over. So first just with a website, writing about stuff, getting involved, talking at conferences, just arguing the case for print magazines, and then the sort of inevitable, not end point, but the inevitable kind of point at which I've got to now was when I was talking about all these magazines and celebrating them, people say, well, where can I buy them? And it annoyed me intensely that London didn't have a dedicated space. If you go to Berlin, there are several great magazine shops that are really, do you read me, Billy? In Amsterdam, where we transfer our base, there's the Athenaeum. There are these great shops, and I thought London needed to have a dedicated magazine shop, so I did it, and 7 years later, here we are.
Thank you for doing that as well.
Oh,
Much
pleasure.
And Zena?
So, much like these guys, I was sort of solving a problem. So I'm the publisher of Bloom, which is a magazine about gardening and nature. And I launched it in 2018 when I was a full-time publisher of books. And I was trying to convince my colleagues that nature was important and that we needed to be publishing books about gardening and about the environment and sustainability, and at that time, believe it or not, it was quite a tough sell. And it sort of coincided with me moving into this house and finding myself with a garden for the first time, and like looking around and realizing every magazine, every book, any kind of media that I tried to find inspiration or information was not aimed at me as an urban living, young, at the time, woman. And so I wanted to create something that had a diversity of voice, that wasn't just speaking to wealthy people who maybe lived in Surrey with a giant garden, and that actually tackled a lot of the kind of the state of the world stuff that is so connected to nature and so connected to our ability to go out and grow things. So it's a bit of a mix of stuff in there, but.
And you're on issue 12.
Yes, I just got to send 13 to the printer, so it turned out I was right, and people did want something like this, which is always gratifying. But
So when you were doing that initial research, what else were you seeing? Was it just kind of the stuff in W.H. Smith that were kind of, as you said, but there was really nothing else that was kind of dealing with that subject matter? I find that so interesting.
Yeah. So there was like newsstand titles, which we all know and recognise, so I'm not going to name them, but the big kind of gardening magazines that have been around for decades. But I think maybe one thing that is a bit different about Bloom compared to a lot of these magazines is that right from the start it was meant to be a fusion of newsstand and independent. It was always meant to sit in between the very high-end, esoteric, single subject stuff and the newsstand where, you know, you get a shopping page and a crossword and all of the kind of fun magazine stuff, and it was meant to be in that slot. And I don't think loads of people do that.
No.
So I'm not sure if, I don't know how that has fared for us and whether it's something that has, helped,
But it seems like you made a magazine that people jumped at because it was obviously a massive gap in the market, and that's why it's been going so well. And I think that's something that so many people kind of grapple with. And either they try and do quite a lot of teaching at universities about magazines, and they're trying to find a topic that no one's done a magazine on before. And so they look in crazy places, like they'll be like, okay, I'm going to do one on dog food, and you're like, okay, that is niche, and there might be a place for that, but there's often some of these topics as well that are sort of hiding in plain sight. As you say, like, yeah, it's nature and gardening, which is a very, universally understood thing, but actually it's like a way of looking at it that's a kind of different bit.
And I think just because of the talk is about money and funding, if you're looking at your subject, how do you look at it commercially? And I think because I was already in a job where everything we commissioned, every book we commissioned had to work commercially, but we as editors wanted to make something beautiful and that had an impact and that felt exciting to people, we had to always find that fusion between like commercially viable and beautiful.
Yeah.
And so I think, when you are looking at your subjects and you are thinking, well, I don't want this to fold on issue 2, it does serve you quite well to think commercially as well.
Yeah, Jeremy, do you think, having seen many magazines come through your doors in the past, I don't know how many years it's been, but do you think that's something that a lot of magazines are increasingly doing, or are they not doing it, are they not bothered about it, but thinking commercially, that doesn't seem like something that, or people don't necessarily talk about that kind of like,
I think a lot more magazines have more commerciality to them than people realise. I think, it's a mix. I mean, I think you have to forget the idea that the independent magazine is a sort of defined single way of being. There are so many different business models and thoughts and ideas around how to survive. And there are a lot of magazines that are just purely, the intent is to be, if I say hobby, it sounds a bit dismissive, I don't mean that, but it's a sort of labour of love that you do in the evenings as a side gig. And it's pleasurable, it's raison d'etre is just to exist, and if you can keep it going and cover the cost, then whoopee, and a lot of people get a lot out of that, that's fine. But for other people, there are plenty of magazines that have the ambition to exist as and don't seem to necessarily confine themselves to the indie title. They just want to be a good magazine, they want to be popular, they want to be the best in their sector, they want to beat the commercial sector,
Yeah.
And there's a whole kind of range of stuff in between, in the middle of that.
Yeah, David, where does Paperboy fit in that? Would you say that when you started Paperboy it was with sort of commercial gain in mind?
I think I've got a massive dose of imposter syndrome right now because I don't really think I'm the best for this panel about how to fund a magazine. Or maybe I'm a good example of how not to fund a magazine.
I think the reason to put it is why I invited you, because I knew that you started it off your own back in lockdown, and I also know you're quite you're generous with your fees, considering you haven't got loads of cash to give, and you talk openly about how much magazines cost to make, which I think is very handy today. So I mean.
Oh, okay, all right. So just as long as nobody's looking for a solution and going to walk out the door thinking, oh, I know how to fund a magazine, it's dead easy now. Because I think I can quote my accountant by saying, David, it's a fucking financial disaster. And that's verbatim. And it's true in isolation as a magazine. But I think the way that I think the magazine's important, and I think as Jeremy just touched on, I think it should exist. And I think it's a good publication. It provides opportunity. It provides an arena for people to write. But it doesn't make a huge amount of financial sense. And if I can be blunt, I'll tell you how I pay for it, and I'll tell you what I get from it. So I'm a designer and art director like Jeremy, and I work commercially for brands. And I don't want to sound Robin Hood about this, but they pay for it. These brands pay for it, and in a funny kind of covert way, it does fall into a hobby for me. It's done when I have downtime in my day job, and it's the big clients pay for it. and that's the long and short of it. And that's why my accountant calls it a financial disaster, because he doesn't quite understand the mechanism, because it costs more to make the magazine than it does to sell the magazine. So he sees it as black and white, as that. And I see it slightly differently. I see it a little bit like, well, Mulberry can afford to pay me to do it. Is this being recorded back there? It's alright, that's it, just before I slag anybody. Before I fucking go to town and then I get fired and I don't have any money to do it. So essentially, yeah, I don't want to say I rob. I make money from commercial clients, and I use the skills that I use for Paperboy magazine, and I take that money, and rather than spend it on train sets or carbon fibre bikes or whatever people spend money on, I spend it on making a magazine, and I get an enormous amount of pleasure out of it because I get to commission people, I get to put together a magazine. I'm no spring chicken. I've been doing graphic design and art direction for 20 years now, since I left art school. So I've been creative director of Esquire, I've worked in various magazines over the last 8 years, and worked in wallpaper magazines, so I know what it's like to put together a magazine for someone else. So my indulgence is putting together a magazine that I want to put together. And that's how I pay for it. I work hard over there so that this can exist. And that seems to work as a business model, but it's taken me 20 years to be able to say to a handbag maker, I want some money to make that for you, and then filter it through into the magazine. And I think Liv touched on the fact that I pay people to be in the magazine, which is kind of unusual for a magazine that loses money. But it's a shit fee. It's a democratic shit fee that everybody gets, and whether it's Lou Stoppard that writes for the New York Times, or whether it's 15-year-old Ella who's still at school who wrote, everybody gets 150 quid, and it's democratic. And for me that was important, that there was a token value attached to that, and that's part of the overall funding that I take from my commercial business, and I put it into that, and I go Paperboy, and it mops it up like a big thirsty sponge and spits out a little magazine at the end.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit Robin Hood. I like this Robin Hood analogy, I just thought that the way here.
Yeah. And also the magazine you've made is very well produced, and you, as you say, you've earned the money through the brands to make something that useful. But you could, equally, if you were taking, let's say, I don't know, 10% of your wage, probably far less, I don't know, to make this magazine, anyone could do that, because no matter what, you can still make something that's photocopied, you can still save it. It's about what you're saying is it's taking like a portion of what you earn and putting your spare time into it, and knowing that it's your earnings that are going into making a magazine for the sake of you wanting to make a magazine. It isn't because yours is obviously, probably, I wouldn't be able to afford to make your magazine, but what I'm trying to say is like anyone could if they could just take a little bit out and put it towards that. Because magazines can be cheap to make. But
yes, no, they really can, and because I've worked in magazines for quite a long time, I wanted to toy with the idea of a magazine. I wanted to play with what a magazine was, and I think the production values kind of do that. I use book cover material to bind it in. I wanted to challenge the idea that a magazine's disposable. In issue 1, which was another bad financial idea, I bounced some stamps into the back so that when you were finished with the magazine, you read it, tells you the last page, you send it to someone you like. So the magazine had a life beyond a regular magazine. So each one kind of grew, and I felt as if it sounds indulgent, and maybe it is indulgent, but I don't want to sound extravagant, because it was about challenging how people perceive a magazine, which is something, Jeremy's kind of underplaying his role in the conversation about magazines over the last 20 years. It was a blog he first started, is that right? Yeah. And everybody that worked in any of the magazines that I worked on avidly scrolled this thing at lunchtime because there was a commentary there. And that's when I realised there was a culture, an underground culture that was seeding into everything else.
But I think that's a really important part of magazine making is that you do challenge what the magazine is, and that's for me what's really interesting about it is that magazines as a form aren't just this one thing, they are multiple things, they're different types of things, you can test them and play with them. And that's what excites, that's what interests me, that's what intrigues me about what you're doing, but equally intrigues me about how you're going in a slightly different angle but coming up with something which is an amalgam of two different things. And they're all different, everyone's doing something different, and I think we're here to talk about financing magazines, but I think you have to bear in mind that it can't only be about money, it has to be about value in other respects. And I think if you're helping kids start to write and create stuff, and if you're encouraging professionals who have very serious careers in one sphere to do something in a different sphere, then that's another whole adding to our human wealth.
Yeah, for sure. I think, well, Zena, when you were making Bloom in the first bit, were you sort of worried about going into it in terms of thinking, how am I going to pay contributors, how am I going to pay printing? What were you thinking when you were first starting out and you had this idea of like, okay, I want to go for this idea? How did you then actually go and do it? And was that really nerve-wracking?
It was mental. It was a really stupid thing to do, which I sometimes have to try not to regret because it's such a snowball. But a really healthy dose of naivety and loads of enthusiasm. I just absolutely had to do it. Once I got the idea in my head, I had to do it. And I had £5,000 to launch my first issue, which was just my own money. Still my own money. We don't lose money, but I think maybe on the ones that we sell to stockists, we make maybe 35p or 50p on a copy. So it's really tough.
And how much does it sell for?
£8. Yeah. So we pay everyone in the magazine. I pay everyone in the magazine, and I still use the money that comes in to pay for it. But I think in those early days, I'm not good at spreadsheets and I'm not good at numbers. So everything's on the back of an envelope, and if I can just sort of work it out and think, oh well, I need to sell this many to be able to break even. Fine, and then I was cavalier, is what I would say, and then it took off on issue 1, and so then you feel like, right, I'm going to keep going with this, I'm going to keep going, and if I don't lose money, if I can just sell what I need to sell to be able to print the next one, and to be able to pay the contributors, then I'll keep going, and that's kind of how we're still here.
You just haven't stopped?
Yeah, I haven't stopped.
How often does the magazine come out?
3 times a year.
Okay, so if you're on 12, see, I can't do maths either, was that 5 years or something?
So the first one was in 2018.
Okay, yeah. God, that is so nerve-wracking though. So you're making at the moment at 30p per issue, if someone...
Yeah, so there's different ways of selling magazines. So you can sell them online as a single copy, or you can sell them as subscription. So we do that, and the margin there is much better than selling them to stockists. But you need stockists because stockists are like a shop front kind of for what you do. So if you can get your magazine out into different stores, people will pick it up. They might want to come back and buy it from you, or they might buy it there. But it's a way for people to see it in real life, and so it's really important. And so those ones do not make money. That's because it costs £8 to ship them.
That's the toughest part of the whole industry is distribution, shipping, people taking their cut.
But I think it's probably working out interesting ways to kind of distribute it that aren't just the classic way of having 5,000 books in your bedroom and just posting it out every day in the post office. How do you do it, David?
There's a distributor that I use called Antenna, who are cleverly connected, and they buy the magazine. No, they don't buy the magazine. I give them an amount of magazines, they distribute them. I think, Jeremy, you might be able to help with this. I get 40%, the shop that sells it gets 40%, and the distributor gets 20%.
We get 35, I think, or maybe 30 of them.
Yes, the numbers are vague. I'm a bit like you, I try to ignore the numbers, they're on a notes on my phone somewhere. But distribution is not, this is not good advice, is it? Distribution is a real loss leader, but the advertising that it does is like being in this shop, for example, people Instagram it, people come in and they buy it. It's a real, it's a real infectious way of doing things, and you can buy Paperboy in most countries in the world now because of Antenna and people like Jeremy. It's a real
But you started out distributing it yourself, right? I mean, you came to the shop and said...
I did, yeah. I dropped it off like an actual Paperboy.
Yeah.
Right? And yeah, that was kind of how I got my head around it. And then Antenna got in touch, said, would you be interested in distributing it? And I think that was a real key moment where I looked at the figures and I thought, right, rather than lose £5 an issue, I'm going to lose £10 an issue in those ones. So how does that work out? And you've got to kind of take a little bit of a wager on that one, but it really worked. It really kind of spread the numbers and spread the news.
So you also sell off your website?
Yep, so then therefore people feed to the website and they come on the website, which is a complete pain in the arse because you get this little ding and you go, oh fucking hell, I've got to package up another magazine. And I write a little note and they package it up, and then you go to that big hungry post box and you stick it. But luckily they all happen at a time. When you launch a magazine, there's like 300 or 400 happen within 2 weeks, and then you kind of set aside your Saturday and Sunday, you get Columbo on in the background, and you just sit and you pack a bunch of magazines, and there's something strangely cathartic about it. And it's quite rewarding actually, thinking that people want to consume what it is you've made, and there's a real satisfaction about it. It's enormously rewarding, and I'm trying to balance out things that I get out of this as well. It's not. I'm not all like godlike and being worthy. I get an enormous amount of satisfaction out of making a magazine. I get to work with my pals, I get to work with new people, and and I don't have an editor giving me shite because I want to put too many pictures in there. I'm the master of what is in there. So it's a real pleasure for me to do. Even the posting out bit. But the mechanics of distribution have got so much more tough since Brexit. I'm really thinking that. And the amount of magazines that I've sent to Denmark and they get returned 3 months later, and it's sore and it's expensive.
Yeah.
And that's the bit that hurts when I go to say something even wrong. Anyway, I digress. Was that the question?
Kind of, yeah. I do think like when you've got a magazine, you've made a magazine, I think giving it out, the idea of you coming here or going anywhere with like a pile of magazines that you've made, there's something so infectious and contagious when someone's made a magazine and they want to show you it. And I think that's why the magazine community is so great, because everyone knows how hard it is to make a magazine. To see someone doing it. Someone told me once this thing about like spare tyre theory, like basically if you're driving down the motorway and you see someone who's broken down, and if they're like waiting for help, you might just drive past. But if they're seen to be sort of trying to fix it, you're more likely to stop. And I think there's something in that with magazines where it's like you see someone's trying really hard, so your gut instinct is to be like, oh, what's that? And then you help each other. Support you need is massive, and no one knows about how to distribute stuff. No one knows about how much the postage is going to change. No one knows that Brexit's going to necessarily happen. All that stuff, it's always changing. So to be able to sort of share ideas around all the time is
and
very
people do share.
Yeah.
I'm going to share something.
Okay.
I'm scared. Don't tell them about the sauna.
Got the pictures. Distributors do a really, really good job, and it's really vital. But they will push you. They have a tendency to push you to be in every single shop. They will want you. So I mean, my feeling when you launch magazines, it should always start off quite small and put your effort into making fewer numbers of magazines, but they're more beautiful and more better quality, better production. And start small and sort of aim high in terms of each individual item, so that when people get it, they really get it and they love it, and then you can build from there. But the distributor and the general sort of production, bigger world of magazines are still stuck in the old mode, in the old model, which was based around the weeklies and the quarterlies, which was a very wasteful model. It was a model of, for instance, if you're producing a monthly magazine, and to round up numbers, maybe you at the time 100,000 copies got sold in this country across all the newsagents. But in order to sell 100,000 copies, you had to produce 200,000 copies, so that all the newsagents had 5 copies, and then 100,000 of them would be trashed, put in the recycling, which is wasteful. I mean, it's wasteful in every sense. It's waste of money, of power, of resource, environmental in terms of production, and everything about that is wrong. The distributors still default to that mode, so they will encourage you to go to every shop there is, rather than focus on, because that's their business, is to sell as many as possible. They want to sell as many as possible and get as many of their 40% or whatever it is. But the more sensible attitude is to try and get it, to decide to put it into a few specialist shops, or, I mean, if you're in gardening, there are probably, you want to be in magazine shops, but there are gardening shops and other specialist shops that would be particularly appropriate for your audience. And so aim carefully to where you distribute, but then sell direct online.
Yeah.
Where so you build an audience through the clever placement and as little wastage as possible, but then have them up in your spare room or under your bed and be posting them out.
The reason Jeremy is saying that is because so when the distributors send them out to shops, if the shop doesn't sell it, they bin it.
Yeah.
That's the bit that hurts. So you only get paid for the ones that sell.
Yeah.
So what we do now is only distribute half through a distributor, and I do the other half. So, like you say, I reach out to independent shops, florists, plant shops, garden centres, anywhere that kind of feels like there's a connection, and I ship them myself, and it's what's called firm sale. So they have to pay for the ones they take, and they can't, send them back. And then the distributor gets a really lean quantity, so that there's really limited waste. I've got a really good relationship with our distributor, which is MMS. And if you don't give them too many, then they can't send out too many, and they sell more, basically. So you just have to. It's trial and error, and you have to sort of learn on the go, but if you don't want to lose half your stock, then you sort of have to think about how you're getting it out into the world and who's doing that for you.
Yeah, and if you kind of understand who you're talking to, it's just going to where those people are and just sort of putting it down, and then you either go down the route of being like, right, I've got your attention, now we're only going to print as many as people want. So you do a print run of like, okay, it's the kids stuff, you've got like 120 people want a magazine, you only print 120 or something, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think that is, the idea of places just throwing boxes of magazines away is just like...
It's really depressing. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of like, when you're all making magazines, what do you reckon is the biggest like hidden cost that took you by surprise, that you were like, oh, didn't see that coming?
I don't think there's anything you don't see coming, in that like print is expensive, shipping is expensive, people's talent is expensive, your time is precious. It's all things that you know already. I don't think there's any surprises. I think the real shock is how much all of those things have gone up.
Yeah.
And that's been a real, I mean, even it has been a shock because it's happened quite quickly. And I actually looked up a couple of figures because I thought you might ask.
Yeah.
And when I started this in 2018, you could ship a copy to a customer for £1.80 plus VAT. And now the very cheapest I can send a single copy is £2.45.
Wow. Using the post?
That's through our warehouse, which is the absolute cheapest you could.
Yeah. They've got a good deal.
Yeah. So they've got economy of scale, and they can like send it out as cheaply as possible through Royal Mail. So it's like kind of an astonishing shift, and the same thing with print, which is like 30% up on from October, like 30% up in just 6 months. So I think being kind of prepared for a few challenges is always good. So like printing lean and knowing where you're going to sell them and knowing that someone's going to buy them is all really kind of helpful stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you know what I was most surprised about?
Yeah.
I was most surprised about people's generosity, both in terms of time and commitment. I knew of Liv before we'd actually met. In fact, we didn't meet until not too long ago. And I got hold of Liv's email and fired an email saying, would you write for Paperboy? I love what you write. Bang, 2 days later, of course I'll write for it. And now this is writing for something that doesn't exist. And that generosity was repeated again and again and again and again with people's time. It was 150 quid, I'm pretty sure, like, the time you spent, you could have earned more money whether you were doing something else, but you were prepared to take a punt on something, and I was endlessly surprised by people's generosity to contribute to something once I explained an idea. And that was something that took me back, actually. I thought it was going to be a lot harder to convince people like Live to Write for the magazine, but it was actually quite easy, if you don't mind me saying. I'm not saying you're an easy. But it wasn't just Liv, everybody was easy. No, they weren't. But
because also I was going to ask, did everyone invoice? I think I invoiced, but I remember at the time thinking like, should I invoice? Because it's like, if you're going to work for someone's magazine that's just started, that is starting something, I remember feeling funny about invoicing the 150 quid.
Everyone invoices.
No, but I sort of think like, I'd rather that money went to you making another issue than it would for, do you know what I mean?
You're on your own.
People did say that. And I think like...
But you did invoice.
Yeah, but I wasn't sure that
Plus
everyone
that,
else would.
and expenses. No, you didn't actually do expenses. But there was some people who said just invest it in the next issue, to which point I said that we'll name a charity and we'll give it to charity instead, because I was adamant that everybody that was in there got that money, and you know, the school kids loved it. It wasn't a huge amount, but they were like, I'm getting paid for drawing or writing, this is extraordinary. They couldn't quite get their head around that fact, but I could only go in there, and actually the school kids were the hardest people to work with. It was also lockdown, and I was chatting to them in Glasgow and on a Zoom, and they're all eating their lunch, and they're going, "What's this fucking bald guy on this screen talking shit? What does he want us to do?" You know, and it's actually commissioning someone who's at school age was an enormous challenge, and the only thing that I could dangle in front of them was 150 quid, because they've got no idea who no offence, Liv is or any of these great writers that were going to be alongside. The only carrot I had was 150 notes, and they were really hard to commission, but in a funny kind of way they brought the naivety that you had mentioned about doing something that they hadn't done before. They brought a real flamboyance. So I was most surprised about, everyone costs a million quid these days, but most surprised about people's generosity and that thing of people going to just invest in the next issue or whatever, and that seems to repeat and repeat and repeat, regardless of how many we sell it. It's a repeat thing. I think people's generosity in terms of time and just people being pretty straight up with their time. I think it's really impressive.
I think commissioning content is always, it's even the publications that you would have thought have like tons of budget to pay contributors, they often get by and do it for free. Like even a lot of, I worked at Days for a bit, and they were often just, it was all kind of like, you know, you'd get these massive famous photographers doing it for free, or people mucking in for free here and there, and then there, you know, people who were like just starting out and they would invoice, but others would kind of like do more favour stuff. And then if you look at the magazines in a year, like it's so fascinating who's not in a bad way, but who's paying contributors and who's just getting mates to do it, who's putting all their budget into the commissioning, it's something that I don't think there's a rule for it. I think every magazine commissions content in a different, I don't know what the word content thing, just say it like.
I think they all do it in different ways, but for me there's a rule, and that's it. It doesn't matter how much you pay, but you pay. It changes the relationship, even if it's less, you know, if it's £50 or doesn't have to even be £150. I think it's really important to have that ability to say, look, I'm paying you, and that wasn't good enough. Can you redo it? I mean, in an extreme case. I mean, if you're not.
Do that, David?
I think I'm too nice for that. But I think
too good at commissioning.
I'd never ever wanted to start something where you're making people work for free. I mean, it's not something I wanted to contribute to, and it was not part of the sort of business, I guess, that I'd want to run. Like, people deserve to be paid for their time. So,
But it's also a relationship. I mean, Philip Sinden, who's a world-renowned photographer, sat on the back, who's trying to hide. We've worked with each other on and off for, I don't know, maybe 15 years now, and I think there's you develop that balance of, if I've got money, I think he knows I'm going to phone him up and go, by the way, I've got money for this job and I'm going to be able to fly here, there's going to be a good laugh. Or I can phone him up and say, Phil, this is going to cost you money to do, is that alright? And I think there's a genuine relationship you can build through these, and I don't think there's a thing about finance in magazines. I feel as if there's a kind of lawlessness about it, and people do take advantage of that lawlessness, but I think the relationships you can build between writers and photographers, I think, is a genuine one. So one thing that you can be shrewd about is commissioning people and how you do that. I mean, my fee was kind of, I established that to pay everybody the same amount, so there was no conversation about it. The conversation was, it was democratic, and that was it. And some people did take it, some people didn't take it. But I think
did anyone say no?
Yes, yes. A few people said no. Not Liv.
Desperate Liv.
Yeah, those expenses. Yeah. What's that were you doing with the Groucho Club until a few people did say no, and I kind of pushed it a little bit. But I don't know really what you can say after that point.
Yeah.
And I did genuinely take the money and just put it back in the pot to print the next one, and come up with stupid ideas that would spend the money.
Yeah, of course. Wanted to say as well, we're only a small room. If you've got any questions you wanted to jump in at any time, may as well. If anything comes up, you don't have to wait till the end. Just wanted to say that now. And also, is there any topic that we've talked about so far that you want to know more about, or is there anything you really want to know that we can talk about that, what time is it? Yeah. Oh, hello.
Hi. Do you have display advertising or advertorials to get money that way?
I mean, I'm terrible because I'm so obsessed with editorial and I want every page to be beautiful, and so I don't take any advertising because I just love magazines too much, and I want the product to be a really enjoyable read. A little bit like what you were saying, it's really hard to make commercial decisions when what you want to do is make a beautiful product. So yeah, I have tried in the past, and every time I see an ad or even contemplate sometimes putting something in a magazine, I just think, oh, I could do such a great story there in its place that I end up not running it. So yeah, but that's a great way to make money.
So you don't do it for aesthetic reasons?
Yeah, purist,
yeah.
a total purist, yeah.
Would you do it if you were allowed to work with the person to design the advert, or is that based on editorial?
Maybe. We have done, there's a few brands that I really love that are super ethical, really sustainable, that I don't mind telling their stories, and a few times we've collaborated. Money doesn't always change hands, but we will have something some sort of benefit, they run an event for us or something like that. So there's different ways of working with people that doesn't always rely on money. But that there's still something in it for you, or to get your kind of philosophy across, or your message, or your magazine. But yeah, I think as well, you need a huge reach on your magazine to be able to sell advertising. It's not as easy as just booking in an ad. Advertisers want to know that they're going to be reaching maybe tens of thousands of people before they spend any money. So it's not something to rely on if you're setting something up.
I was talking to someone earlier, I think it was Jeremy, about, I can't remember which magazine it was. There was a girl in Leeds who made this magazine, a music magazine, about Leeds music at the time. So I think she was at Leeds Union doing sort of thing about what's going on around town, interviewing local bands, that sort of stuff. And so she worked out to print it, it would cost something like 300 quid, or a bit more. It was quite zany. And so she just went around to local businesses in Leeds, like a butcher, a cobbler, hairdresser, and a couple of other things, and just got them they gave 50 quid a page and just did local adverts, because it was a local magazine, so it worked. You couldn't do that necessarily, and you could if it was a very London-centric magazine, but I thought that was so clever to go to, rather than sort of trying to approach Nike to get an advert, you just go and be do you want an ad in the magazine? And it's a hairdresser being yeah, alright, and then you just put me into it, or you get sort of an offer or something, and that is such a good way of thinking about advertising. It isn't the kind of, you don't need they're not then relying on you having like 5,000 print or something. It's just like, yeah, we'll just do this. And also it probably comes into that whole thing of like seeing this woman do this thing, and they'll be like, yeah, we'll support you in that. But I'm sure there's ways around advertising that aren't just...
Yeah, I'm at a crossroads with Paperboy really. I'm going to do issue 4 as it is without any form of funding apart from my own pot. But people have approached and said, A, can we advertise, or B, can we collaborate? And I think, as tempting as that is, it's too much for me to get my head around because it's a hobby. But ultimately it'll change and compromise what it is I do, because there'll be advertising in there, whether it's advertorial or display. Do people know what advertorials are? Does everybody know what an advertorial is? An advertorial is essentially paid for content, so you produce the content, but a company pays for it. So it'll be like one of our models holding a Mulberry handbag. And it'll kind of usually say advertising or something at the top, but it looks like the magazine, whereas adverts are dead straightforward. It's like Mulberry handbag, but it says Mulberry, that size across it.
The kings of that are Monocle. Who, if you know Monocle, you'll see pages in there, and at the top it'll say Monocle times Chanel or Monocle times Rolex or whatever it is.
Real clever.
And then otherwise it looks exactly the same as the rest of the content in that issue, and that is paid for content. The brand concerned have paid Monocle for that space, and Monocle have created it, and they've done it in collaboration. Some people have a problem with that. I think it's a legitimate way of paying for what you do, as long as you're honest about it.
I think that's the thing, because the legitimacy I see here is that the magazine can keep existing, then I think the compromise of having money coming in from elsewhere is something that I can't ignore. So the 4 or 5 brands that have approached and asked to be in there, it would be stupid of me not to, because in a weird kind of way, like, if that can make the magazine exist for another 10 issues and I get 5 young people in each issue, then that's the figures start to work out, and I'll be quite happily take big brands' money in a more direct way. Also, so my accountant is off my back. Stops giving me.
Also, just because it's an advertorial doesn't mean it has to be bad content, because if it's a good editor in charge of the magazine, like in Monocle, it's their team's ideas that then get put into advertorial. So, for example, if it was like a Chanel advertorial, it might be a fascinating story about, the women in Italy who pick the flower petals that end up making Chanel No. 5, and that's actually really, if it's photographed well by a great photographer, which they often commission, and it's a really good story that you would read in the New York Times, then it's kind of like you're not losing anything. But most of the time with advertorials, the content's bad, and that's what it's bad. It doesn't have to be.
Exactly. It can work.
Yeah, for sure.
I think as soon as a client's involved, ultimately the word compromise keeps popping into my head. And having worked on that, I think you compromise, and then I worked on Esquire for 8 years, and part of my job is to go away and do the covers. And tell you brief, Robert Patterson needs to be wearing Dior. That's like that, and it compromises the outcome, because you're ultimately got a brief that's not like, you can't say to the stylist, stick him in a pair of underpants and we'll do the most amazing cover doing a handstand. He's got to be wearing Dior, and he's got to be so that Dior then spend their money in advertising with it. So for me there was always, I've got an association with the compromise. Now, that's not to say that when something like Monaco come along, it was a real refreshing thing, because they weren't trying to disguise it. And I think up until then everybody disguised, paid for editorial, and I think they had a real fresh take on it. And I think you documented it quite well on the blog at the time, maybe. So maybe you didn't draw attention to it, maybe everybody's just aware of it.
I think we did do something about we did. It's a long time ago.
Yeah. So the compromise, and I think like, if anybody who advertised in here, I think it would need to be pretty strict to go, this is what it is, and this is what we'll do for you.
But it becomes another, it's another part of content management. It's sort of, you have to manage it and keep to your principles and do your terms as you are.
I think the compromise is too much most of the time. The brand has something that they want to sell, and they're going to want to do that in a certain way. And part of the fun of making your own magazine is having complete autonomy over those decisions, what you want the headline to be or how you want to position something. You may want to write about that brand anyway, I've been guilty of that before, but in your own way, rather than in the way they tell you to. But again, it's just being a total purist over magazine content, and if you want to make money, that is not the way to do it. So it's that, again, that battle between being an independent and wanting to have something that's got integrity versus surviving and being commercial. And I think it's just a really fine balance that everyone will just find their own comfortable place with, out of either just being good at that or necessity.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's dead good having that independence. I know what you're saying. There was so I don't know if people know how fashion stories work, but you call in brands and you stylist phones up and say, oh, we're going to do the next issue of Paperboy, blah blah blah, and we're going to shoot rain jackets or something. Brand, oh yeah, that's cool, we'll send you 3 of our latest rain jackets. Anyway, Prada were like, is this a luxury story? And I was like, no, it's not a luxury story, we're going to mix it. And there's a lot of second-hand clothes in there as well, because I strongly believe in shopping in your own wardrobe and not consuming so much. But Prada refused to give us anything because it wasn't going to be a purely luxury story with Louis Vuitton and Balenciaga. They wanted to be seen in that crowd, and they weren't happy to be seen with a pair of distressed Levi's jeans. And that for me was that was a nice moment of serenity, apart from me ranting and calling them pricks for fucking 24 hours. As soon as I got over that moment, I thought, actually, they don't need to be in there. That's okay. I don't need that brand in there. They don't need me. This is okay. Maybe this is a story from a therapist actually. Maybe that's a reason of my rejection issues coming out here. But that integrity and being able to just pull back and go, listen, speaking to stylists, just don't ask Prada again. You know what the conversation is, and they're not happy to be seen with a 10-year-old beanie. We should be encouraging people to do. We should be encouraging people to mix things up. And I think that kind of independence for me is really important where this is concerned, where I can take that piece of information and not have a nervous breakdown about it and just move on.
And it must be so nice after having worked every day with editors, you're just on your own and do what you want now. It's quite nice.
Yeah, it's
the
quite
freedom
nice.
of magazines is great when you don't have any, you can just do whatever you want.
Yeah, maybe it's a power thing. I just like a total control freak. I just have to have my own way on every page.
It's quite nice though, because you also realise your mediocrity and stuff as well. My media, I'm dyslexic, so the first issue, the first print run was riddled with typos. I mean, it was a disgrace. It was like a high school essay. It was like, oh hell, how did that happen? And I read it 8 times. I read the whole thing 8 times, and it was, and then all of a sudden I had this newfound love for sub-editors who are dated for 20 years and are strangling, killing my piece, making the visuals smaller, making all the words fit in. You're like, and I newfound, and that for me, putting together a magazine was a real, I was learning again, I was pretty shit at that side of things, and the balance was important, so it was important for me to get a sub-editor in the next issue, and read it.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's probably if you're starting out your own magazine, you might not have a team, but you have got friends who can read, and friends who can be honest with you, and mums, dads, people doing proofing. I've got friends whose mum does the transcribing for the magazine for how many pounds it is an hour. They sort of all chip in, and you've definitely got a team of people around you. It's just they're not, in an office being paid by, a big boss.
My mum's on the masthead, she's read every issue 6 times. It's necessary.
Yeah,
it really is. Mums are good at sponsorship.
There's always going to be fun mistakes too. Oh really? Yeah. Also I think more and more spelling mistakes, I'm like, whatever. Life's too short. I'm an editor and I have to proofread all day, every day. I mean, you can never get it perfect. No. And you can beat yourself up about it, but sometimes if I read a mistake in a magazine, I find it, I'm like, ooh, it's quite exciting. in a book, really? I've never had that.
Yes.
You want to sort of call someone up.
Guess what they did.
Yeah, it's great.
There's one word that whenever I type it, I always get it wrong. Magazine.
Magazine.
Yeah, there's something in my finger actions. I go M-A-G. Oh, I can't remember what it is now. M-A-A-G-Z. Yeah.
Or maybe it's
something up here.
Yeah, I think it's something on there, man.
Is there anything else we would? Yeah, hello.
I had a question about the quantity of magazines. If you ever changed it throughout the editions, because I feel like the cost of production is fixed, so you get to pay the collaborators and people. It's a fixed price, and every time I send it to the printers, it's like this optimistic side. It's like if I just print a little bit more, it's gonna sell. And I'll just print 100 more or something, and I have this optimistic side of me. And the partners are like, no, just do this. And so through Brexit and everything, have you upped the quantity of magazines you print, or have you decreased it? And how do you deal with just the amount of magazines that you did print?
That feels like it's always a sliding scale of factors that you never really know where to target it. And I think over the last year, I think the price of paper has doubled. It's safe to say.
Yeah.
All paper has doubled. The printing is going up 25%. It's a moving scale. So what I do is once I've got it ready, I see how much money I've got, see what I can get away with the printers, and then I print accordingly. I get dead excited with the first issue, and I kept just reprinting. It was really dangerous. It was like heroin addiction or something. It was like,
reprint it?
I kept reprinting it, yeah.
That's more expensive than just printing more.
Yeah, I know, but I was excited. I'll get emails from people like Jeremy saying, can we have another 40? I'm like, fucking yes! Yeah, it was your point. So, but then I was like, oh god, I've got a £4 book of stamps bound in. Shit, I'm going to lose £4, 40 times £4. Oh, fucking hell.
Are you just down the newsagent buying stamps?
I was at the post office at Mount Pleasant, and I had to take a magazine in because I was like, please could I have 100 book of second class large letter stamps. They were like, you alright mate, that's like 900 quid, and I was like, oh no, alright, opening another can of beer, let's just do it. It was like a weird circle of love and hate. It was like being a drug addict. It was pretty nasty. But then I balanced out the second one, and I've always printed the same since and tried to gauge. But it's going to be scary the next one because I don't think prices have stopped going up. In fact, they've been quite.
What's the print one now?
1500.
1500. What's your print one?
We started in 2018 on 1500 because that is the break-even number for litho printing. So if you print digital, it's way cheaper. But again, because I'm a purist, I really wanted it on a printer that prints books, I guess.
Is it so smelly?
And it smells good, yeah, it smells nice. So that was our first, and we've gone up and up and up. So your unit price goes down and down.
Yeah, that's why I always want to do it well.
But what you
want to be cheaper, but then I'm always trying.
You want a good relationship with your printer, because there's no point your boyfriend guessing what the difference is going to be. Like, just call them up.
Teaching a few students along the way, I've noticed that they make magazines, and that's the first thing that people put in front of people when you look at them, and you understand it, and your granny will understand it, and your brother will understand it, and everybody kind of understands that as a tangible thing. And for me, I think it's been commercially good as well, so it's kind of, it's a crossover. I had a nice week this morning. I walked in with the latest issue and they were looking over it, and it gave me time to kind of get my shit together and work out what I was going to say to them and sell a nice idea to them, and it was, and they know what you do as well. It's a portfolio. They know my approach to how I want to shoot fashion, they know my approach how I want to create things.
Yeah.
So it's a good business card. It's a big expensive business card.
Big expensive business card. I think it's probably been enough. It's probably time now. Yeah, almost an hour. Everyone's probably very hot, but I imagine you've got questions. We've got two options really. We can sort of mill about and have a drink, and you can ask people questions to their face, or you can ask questions now. Or what do you want? I mean, have you got questions? Hello. You've got the good chair.
Yes. Because this is an event how to fund the magazine, I wanted to ask if you guys ever consider a Kickstarter campaign, and what do you guys think about it, if you have any tips of like running a successful one.
I've done it. Yeah. It's a brilliant way to launch a magazine. It's almost made for magazines because It goes back to print runs and how many you're going to sell. It did come up earlier, I think you mentioned it, but if you do a successful Kickstarter campaign, you know exactly how many you need to print to, you know how many, it's like a pre-order system for magazines, so it's brilliant for that. You know how many you need to make and what you need to do. The other thing that's fantastic for is it makes you address a lot of the questions that you can easily overlook around marketing. So it makes you have to think about what is, I mean, the simple things, what is my magazine, who is it for, what is my ambition for it, and just you have to sell it to someone before you make it, which often people overlook. You know, you get excited about doing something and not. It's like a sort of funnel that takes you down this process of answering all those questions so that you can then explain it to anybody and sell it. There's a lot more detail to go into, but it works really well for magazines. It's really worth considering. The complicated thing with the magazine, though, is that, of course, it's one of a series. There's going to be issue 2 and issue 3, and if you do a Kickstarter for issue 1, you need to try and build in the mechanism to keep funding for issue 2 and 3 and on, rather than just do one. And as I've seen happen, people then go and kickstart issue 2, and then they kickstart issue 3, and it's not really. I mean, how many? It's kickstarting. It's issue 1 you're meant to be funding and setting something up that you can then grow. Is that helpful? Yeah. I mean, you plan to start?
Yeah, and I've seen like few magazines being on Kickstarter. I'm just always like curious how they go and like market it. It's like, you know, you go on Kickstarter and you see so many. So I was just wondering how you can make it successful, because you see also a lot of publications that look great and they never reach the goal. Yeah. Which is really sad.
Well, I mean, the thing to do is look at some examples of the ones that did make it, and there. I mean, there's now I've got to think about what they are. There's Ink magazine. There's I can look some up, but I can't off the top of my head remember. Racket started. There's some very good examples, and it is literally. I think so much about marketing or communicating to people, explaining to people about your magazine, is trying to do it like as if you're talking to someone, just saying, my magazine is Racket, and it's about tennis, and it's about the culture of tennis, and I'm going to produce it called, or, you know, just, it's like talking to someone about what your idea is and explaining it to them. And Kickstarter is a fantastic vehicle for that. And there are other crowdfunding platforms available.
Other crowdfunding platforms are available. Okay, I reckon that's it for now. But if you want to hang about and ask any more questions for any of the panelists or each other, whatever, then please do. But thank you, Jeremy, for having us, and thank you, David, and thank you, Zena, for coming on.